At what point is the private sector willing to pay to do what needs to be done in the region?
We have a diet of limitations, but not a sufficient discourse on our possibilities.
This is a critical step in our regional integration process.
Mistrust within countries is defeating us. It's not an economic matter, that is a matter for mindset.
West Indian people, we are a gem.
Let's advance our partnership together through the region.
Let us organize and do that together.
We need to ensure that there's transparency in what we do.
I do it because I love it. I'm passionate about watching things grow.
If there's a will, you will find a way to make it happen.
This is our first colloquium of this sort, so we're on a learning curve. We will probably do a different format sort of next year, where we'll have the plenary and then we'll have the business to business. But we have had extremely good engagement over the last 2 days, particularly with the private sector players, to give us a sense of where they'd like us to go and what they'd like us to do and what the next step should be. So I'm going to just hand over to David Jessup now from the Caribbean Council, have him go through the last 2 days in terms of the key elements that have emerged, and then we can discuss how we move forward in the ensuing months ahead. Thanks.
Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I feel that Caribbean Export has given me the unenviable task of trying to summarize a day and a half of very rich and complex discussions, but what I'll try and do is summarize, as I see it, the main points emerging from the discussions, and perhaps indicate some areas in which Caribbean Export might take forward some of those ideas. I think yesterday morning we began with a rather bleak outlook for the Caribbean. 2 decades on from the recommendations of the West Indian Commission, it was quite clear from the speakers that very little has happened. I think Sir Sridhar Ramphal was eloquent about this, particularly when he said that the time for action was actually a manifesto to capture past strength for younger generations to take forward. But as we heard from him and from other speakers, there was no CARICOM Commission, no export-led growth, instead a Caribbean that in terms of integration was unraveling. Minister McLean and the CARIFORUM Secretary General both made clear in their remarks that the global landscape had changed. Caribbean trade remained stubbornly stuck with old partners, while the fastest growing markets in the world, China, India, Brazil, etc., the Caribbean enjoyed very little relationship with. We heard also that exports to the European Union were stagnant, trade in services was declining, and foreign direct investment stock with the European Union was also in decline. There also seemed yesterday morning to be a consensus that the problems facing the region predated the 2007-8 economic crisis. There were also many questions about why, with so many trade agreements, nothing significant was occurring in the way of export-led growth. There were, however, having said that, during the course of the morning, some very interesting practical suggestions. I was particularly struck by the remarks of Minister Pinder. The Minister spoke about new ways to look at regional economic integration, to make use of geographical position for value-added goods trade, and he suggested linking production to logistics, structured in a way to develop a value chain trade that matched manufacturing expertise in different countries. The point was also made that Section 238 of the EPA actually was a basis for improved inter-regional trade. In another very interesting set of remarks, Arnold McIntyre suggested that the macroeconomic measures necessary at a regional level, he set out those measures that he saw as necessary to stimulate growth, but perhaps, wise man, he said nothing about the political will required to actually deliver them. But we also heard about other problems, the problems of EPA implementation, and the potential for a decline in European Union development support. We also heard about supply-side constraints. This figured in many presentations, whether the comments were about transport or energy or financing. And other speakers yesterday morning spoke about the erosion of the Caribbean's preferences as a result of new trade agreements, for instance, between Europe and Central America or Andean nations. Having said that, it wasn't all negative. There were a number of comments that were made that pointed to existing bright spots. For instance, one of the speakers yesterday morning spoke about the Dominican Republic agriculture and manufactured exports, how they were growing. Talked about the export of electrical components from the OECS, agriculture from Belize, and pointed out that rum was a positive story across the region, and that services were expanding, particularly in the context of tourism, but a lot of data was missing, so it was very hard to analyze how that growth was moving forward. Minister Hilton also indicated how the Caribbean Sea and the region's location is a realizable asset. I was fascinated when he spoke about the fact that 50% of cruise shipping and yachts, the global capacity in those areas, were actually within this region. He also spoke, which I think is a significant new opportunity, about the enlargement of the Panama Canal and the opportunity this presents to the region, and particularly, as he pointed out, to Jamaica, to be a logistics center at the center of north-south and east-west trade. He made quite an important point, I think, when he said, is the Caribbean to be a victim or a beneficiary of this? And I think that's an interesting and important challenge. In another set of remarks, Professor Victor Bulmer-Thomas asked quite an interesting question, I thought, about would the future involve a paradigm or a country shift? He made the point that you can't rule out China raising all boats, but I think he seemed to conclude that most solutions are likely to take place at a country level. And he pointed to niche areas of opportunity, services exports, and niche areas such as medical tourism, healthcare, films, education, etc. The morning session was followed by something which I had the pleasure to chair, but I actually found quite uplifting. We had a group of 6 companies that all expressed optimism, all pointed to very different sorts of options that they had explored, all looked at new ways to approach traditional markets, all took a very different kind of approach to perhaps what has been traditional in the Caribbean, whether they were talking about tea or shrimp or beer. I took away from that session some quite clear messages, a real need to diversify markets away from those that were traditional, a need also, and I think this was pointed out by the exporter of shrimp, not to look past the intra-regional market despite its problems. There was a point made, which was also important, a need to engage governments to consummate trade agreements. Another point which really hasn't been significantly picked up during this colloquium, to actively create linkages to diaspora markets and to focus on branding and intellectual property. Moving on to today, our first session was about private sector advocacy. And Sir Ron Sanders started with an introduction asking the question why the private sector was absent from the table of policy making when it was most needed at the table to help address the Caribbean's economic problems. He questioned why there was no regional private sector organization and why there was no standing structure for a regular dialogue between the private sector and government. Jamaica producers spoke about, in the process of diversifying, the need was to look beyond traditional markets to create conversations with countries like China. And I think the sense came across very strongly in that session that there was a need for greater participation of the private sector at a regional level in policy formulation if COTED's decisions are to be taken on the basis of economic benefit rather than political benefit. The point was made by someone that the private sector in all of this needed to be more than just an observer. It also made the point, one of the speakers made the point that the timely provision and receipt of information from a private sector perspective was essential if government was to be taking the right decisions. Rather more sort of directly, one of the speakers effectively said, was there a private sector void? The private sector needed to get its act together. There needed to be, and we've heard a lot more discussion of that as today went on, there needed to be a private sector advocacy body that embraced the whole Caribbean. I think a point that also emerged, perhaps indirectly from some of what was said, is the way forward with such a private sector advocacy body to bring together, as was the case in the past, some of the larger Caribbean companies, and by their more active involvement with government, would this ultimately benefit micro-enterprises in the region. But no one actually said how this might happen. Nobody said, is this a role for Caribbean Export, or who is actually going to try and bring this together. I think the outcome of the session on private sector advocacy indicated very clearly that the Caribbean private sector needs to up its game. It needs better advocacy. It needs national voices to become regional voices. The distance between the public and private sector needed to be closed. There were some interesting models for private-public dialogue in the case of Trinidad. But whether that was relevant, whether that had gone far enough, I think was questionable. And then we got to the final session, the framework for export development. And the point was made, I think, that everybody can't do everything, that CARICOM and the private sector need to find a few specific issues on which to deliver that will benefit growth, economic growth. I think the point was also made that, again, in line with the sort of discussions that had taken place about looking away from traditional markets, that there was a need to refocus on hemispheric markets, particularly in Latin America. There were a number of recommendations made during the presentations during this session on a way forward. But what nobody seemed to be saying is who is actually going to pick this up? Who is going to take these recommendations forward? I mean, there were many excellent ideas to do with maritime transport or other ideas for fostering private sector development. But nobody, as far as I'm aware, during the course of this colloquium, has actually said who is going to pick this up and who is going to implement. Very interesting remarks from Ambassador Maturin, which suggested some quite different ways, perhaps, of looking at trade negotiations. For instance, she was talking about the importance of introducing services into negotiations with non-traditional partners. But she also talked, which is an area which I don't think has been explored enough, about talking to non-governmental partners, health insurance providers, agreements with professional bodies. And she also, which I found very interesting, and that was echoed in a question that we've just had, is the need to look at opportunity within the overseas territories or the French Département d'Outre-mer in this region. The comment was also made, which I think has been a sort of an underlying theme throughout, that expanding services can help grow manufacturing. And I have to say, I was astonished. It took nearly a day and a half before the word profit appeared. I think it was Jimmy Moss Solomon mentioned it. But profit, of course, is required in a modern world with new interrelationships. Now, if the opportunity is to be seen in that light, in a sense, that's as much a challenge to government as it is to the private sector. Other points that were made in the closing session, growth needs brands. The Caribbean, perhaps, which is perhaps an indication of future trends, and governments need to recognize that the Caribbean's multinational regional companies can and may, in the future, if they're to become global, move their domicile if they find the tax environment or the regulatory environment impossible. And the point that came up right at the end, which I think is absolutely significant and telling, is the recognition that export platforms need to change because demand and the markets have changed. Pamela asked me to make some recommendations. Well, I find that extremely complex given the range of topics that were covered, but I do have just half a dozen points to leave you with, and I would assume that out of this very interesting sort of day and a half of discussion that Caribbean Export will pick up these issues and perhaps provide a report or more detail as they how they intend taking forward what has happened. I'm taking away from this a number of points which really suggest recommendations. There needs to be innovative solutions and there needs to be for this region a growth agenda. There are many new ideas, exciting new ideas in the private sector, which suggested that there are ways to circumvent impediments, current impediments to export. But having said that, the private sector needs to be much more creative in the way it relates to the public sector in terms of developing future business. I think also what is very clear to me is that with the demise of Caribbean Association of Industry and Commerce and as Jimmy Moss Solomon said, effectively the Caribbean Business Council, there really is a need for a new region-wide private sector body engaged in a structured dialogue with the public sector. And I'd just sort of end on a thought which any of those of you who read my column in the Caribbean newspapers will see as a constant theme, and that is the world is changing very rapidly, but the Caribbean is not changing at the same pace, and it really needs to. Thank you.
There are just some short comments I want to make before we close. I crave your indulgence. As I indicated, this is the first symposium of this sort, and we definitely intend to repeat it, but repeat it, of course, in a manner that provides for more interaction and business-to-business, actual business-to-business engagement. But the point I also wanted to make, which I think David may have missed a little bit, is, and I asked this question in the advisory group meeting this morning, at what point is the private sector willing to pay to do what needs to be done in the region? And I asked this question because an organization, an entity like Caribbean Export Development Agency, for the most part has been funded by external funds. And as a result, it has gone through various peaks and troughs in its existence because our people won't pay. And frankly, you know, if we're going to talk real, then let's talk real. If we have an agency that is supposed to provide the kind of market intelligence you say you want, the funding, the engagement, the business-to-business meetings, we have great staff who can do this, but they have to be paid. The private sector in the region, I have found, and my experience spans about 27 years in working across the board, is that most are not willing to give any money for anything except unless you put on a dance show. If you put on a dance, you know, and you can sell a few beers and get your, you know, Digicel and everybody up, you know, the banners, it's all good. But when it comes to the behind-the-scenes work that goes into export development and goes into expanding markets and goes into making a country bigger, they're not going to do it. And I think that is the crux of one of the issues that you all have to address. We can make available whatever, you know, tools or, you know, facilities or engagements that you want. But at some point, somebody has to pay the piper. And I think one of the difficulties we also have in the context of our engagement is that the donor countries or the donor know this. And that makes it a little more embarrassing, because the donors know that we're not willing to put in place the kind of, you know, funding that we need for ourselves. And so we are reliant on external funding to carry out private sector development. And I think there's a bit of a disconnect there, and we have to find a way to reconnect the dots on that. And I also say this because I think we are willing to pay external bodies to do what Caribbean Export could do. We pay, I worked with a law firm in the United States that negotiated for rum, for WORSPA. We charged $600 an hour at my level. It was about $1,500 an hour at the partner level. And we paid. But if Caribbean Export asks for $100 for access to an online portal for market intelligence, everybody's going to go screaming to their governments, right, Minister, about, oh, Caribbean Export is wicked, and they're supposed to serve us, and you guys this and that. And so what happens is when the EDF funds run out, Caribbean Export takes a dive again, everybody goes off, and do you understand where I'm coming from here? So the point I'm making is that it's a two-way engagement. I think we are serious about moving forward, and I think David enunciated our vision and our view of the best ways to move forward in terms of branding, niche marketing, market intelligence, export development, taking things to market, and being very concrete about what we do and what we want to do. But we need the commensurate commitment from the private sector to be willing to put something more than demands on the table, but rather saying we're willing to partner with you. We're quite willing to do any advocacy as well. Many of us in the Caribbean Export now have been trade negotiators. We've been in the field. Gail Matherin was one of my first trainers. I remember I met her when I went to New York the first time. I think I turned 22 that when I was there. Anyway, so we can do that. We have Carlos Wharton, who knows every line in the EPA. The point is, we also, however, need people who the private sector willing to pay us for the same thing that they would pay somebody in Europe for. That being said, let me ask Minister Pinder, in terms of next steps, what we intend to do is we will put together the recommendations as we collate them, talk about the next steps we propose in terms of business-to-business meetings and the market intelligence platforms and the export development platforms. We hope to convene another session in the last quarter of this year. And we also want to be able to hear from you. We will email all the presentations, and we also have recorded it, and some people have asked if we can package each of the panels for TV. We can do that. We can get that done if people are interested in having that in their respective countries. And we've also taped it. So the idea is that this is just the beginning. And let me just invite Minister Pinder. I need to apologize. Senator the Honorable Maxine McLean is unable to make it because she has to be in Parliament, actually Cabinet today. So she has asked us to have Mr. Minister Ryan Pinder just give a few closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I'll try to be brief, although my colleagues say whenever a politician says that, it makes you wonder. But I just want to say the event this week, I think, was a tremendous success. I mean, I think it was a good opportunity to get input and dialogue from policymakers, from technicians, from private sector, and put it all together and see where some opportunities lie for us in the region. Certainly we spoke about value chain trade, something I'm very, very high on, obviously, and very supportive of. I think the Bahamas, from a nationalistic point of view, fits squarely within that concept, especially on the logistics side with our deepwater container port and our 230-acre free trade zone in Freeport. We have an opportunity to play a significant role. One thing we didn't touch on, I think has been brought up a couple times, and given that I'm also the Minister of Financial Services, is trade in services. And I know it was brought up today, and I think there was a very important component that was raised, that touched on but not developed, in order for us in the region to effectively export services rather than be a jurisdiction that imports services, is the concept of really developing these mutual recognition agreements for our service professionals. Both regionally, but also I think in the context of agreement like the EPA, to really get the European Union on board with extending reasonable negotiating parameters for mutual recognition agreements for service providers. I think that would really, we saw statistics up here earlier today that shows, for instance, the Bahamas, 82.6% of the GDP is from trade and services, or services-based economy, which is a huge number. So how do we now take that and take that out to the world? We spoke a lot about products and goods, but services, I think, is very important. I think one thing we also need to do, and feeding off what Ms. Coke-Hamilton just said about getting investment into more of these types of programs. For instance, you see Design Caribbean, which is designed to link external buyers with regional high-quality providers of goods in the creative industries, and we want to broaden that, and that was the basis of my comment. Well, I think that, you know, we really need to take a good look in the programming of the 11th EDF with the EU, and really start saying we want the EDF to be true development funding and have true business development programs to cause $10 million a year allocated to these international trade shows to get our suppliers and service providers into the export market, into the international market, linking our value chain strategies, and really looking at the 11th EDF to really promote that. Because I can tell you, and I'm sure my colleague minister will echo the sentiments, governments in the region, it's very difficult for us to be able to raise large amounts of revenues from government-sponsored initiatives. We just have a very narrow revenue stream, very narrow economies, and the ability for governments to dump that type of revenue in is difficult, and certainly private sector has similar concerns. So I think in that context, we have to start looking at how we refocus any development assistance we get as a region and really have it produce tangible benefits for our private sector, tangible opportunities for growth on an export basis, and then link the interregional elements to accomplish that. I know some of my colleagues won't be too happy because they use EDF funding to build roads and seawalls and this and that, but frankly, EDF funding is development and economic development through trade agreements such as the EPA. Let's start using it as such. I think that's a very important thing to walk away, and certainly from a policymaker point of view, as we work on the programming, I think it's important to do those types of things. And the last thing I want to mention, I know everybody is hungry, but we saw a few comments about multilateral business councils, CARICOM business councils, bilateral business councils. These are important elements. Even from a single country to single country, a Northern Caribbean, a Southern Caribbean, a CARICOM, however we want to structure it, having the businesses in the respective jurisdictions come together on a routine basis helps develop how you link the trade together for an export purpose. Lets businesses understand what their core competencies are in different jurisdictions, and then how can that be leveraged along a value chain for ultimate success of all regions. And you can have multiple of these. You can have them by sector, by geography. I think it's very, very, very important. The Bahamas and the Dominican Republic are getting ready to sign a memorandum of understanding in trade in which we memorialize our commitment to a business council between the two countries. We can do it on a number of different platforms, and I think that is something from the private sector point of view, you really should be encouraging your policymakers to come together and put the framework of that together to cause it to happen. Those are some brief concluding remarks that I wanted to give a sense of the way forward, a sense of opportunities we can pull upon to really try to chart a path for success. Imagine if we can have $10 million a year to do trade shows and another $10 million a year to do the technical studies that are required to cause those products and services to be those that we believe we can truly benefit from an export basis. A retooling of our focus for true development assistance and development progress rather than just seeing what money we can get to build a road. I think it's very important that from a policymaker point of view, we do that as well. So I'm very upbeat, I'm very encouraged. I think we have a bright future, frankly. I think we have to retool strategies. We heard that word earlier today, strategies. I think we have to retool some strategies and retool some focus. But I think we, as a region, are resilient people. We're very smart people. We're educated people. And I think we have an opportunity to really take it to the next level. Keep that optimistic framework in mind. So certainly, thank you. I want to say thank you for the invitation to allow me to speak. Thank you to my colleague ministers. Thank you to CETA for putting this framework together. I think it's very important. And I wish everybody a very successful trip home, and let's keep it up. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We're very excited. We're very excited about the possibilities. We're very happy that you came and that you sat here for 2 days. I mean, you have people here, frankly, who have better things to do. So I am really very, 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 very pleased that, ministers stayed, businessmen, policymakers, heads of divisions, and I really think that we're onto a good thing. What we'd love to get, we will email you all your feedback. If you could let us know, how you would want us to move forward. We have a strategy that we can also send to you. And as I said, we will reconvene in about 6 months towards the last quarter of the year. But hopefully what we can have then is firms being brought from elsewhere. We took that on board as a very salient suggestion, that we would bring European and US and other firms in to begin to really do concrete discussions on business. Well, having said that, thank you very much, and have a great time in Barbados until you leave. Thank you.